the sterile cold of the procedure room, saturated with the acrid smell of antiseptic, and an approaching, almost palpable death that soaks into the walls like dampness. On a metal table, reflecting the merciless fluorescent light, lies the altar of the Last Communion. A syringe, a thin needle, an ampule with a crystal-clear liquid, and a rubber tourniquet resembling a hungry boa constrictor, squeezing the last fragile hope. This is not a 19th century battlefield, drenched in blood and mud, not a dim opium den in Canton, drowning in sweetish smoke, but a faceless, anonymous room in the very heart of a modern metropolis, where an ancient demon has found a new, frighteningly effective synthetic form. The body on the couch has long ceased to struggle. It is a wax figure, a work of art of decay, with lips slowly turning blue and pupils constricted to pinpricks, in which neither the light of the lamp nor the glimmer of life is reflected anymore. The breathing, a barely perceptible intermittent flutter of the chest, the pause between shallow breaths, stretches into a deafening eternity, and the heart, this tireless drummer, slows its beat, preparing for the final, absolute silence. This is the finale to which a winding road 6,000 years long has led, a journey that began with a delicate field flower and ended with a cold chemical formula, scrawled on a dusty board in an underground laboratory somewhere on the other side of the world. The piercing wail of an ambulance siren tears through the dense fabric of the night's silence, its desperate sound a belated epitaph, a cry for help that no one in this room, sealed by silence, will hear. This is not a tragic accident, not a system failure, but a logical, meticulously calibrated result. A bold period at the end of a long sentence written by human greed, imperial ambitions, and the brilliant ability to turn nature's greatest gift into the most sophisticated curse. Because in this syringe is not just a drug, but the entire compressed history of civilization, its eternal dreams of a painless paradise, its primal fear of pain, and its insatiable, all-consuming thirst for oblivion. This white crystalline powder is the ghost of a boundless poppy field, the distilled essence of the plant that the Sumerians reverently called Gil, the plant of joy. But to understand how a flower that grants solace and dreams turned into a ruthless machine producing nightmares, how the nectar of the gods became fuel for cartels and the cause of millions of deaths, we must go back to the very beginning. We must return to that misty dawn of time, to the moment when a man's calloused hand first touched the fragile pod, crowned with a jagged corona, and, without knowing it, unleashed a powerful spirit that we have never learned to control. Before it had a name, it was just a flower, stubbornly pushing through the rocky soil of the Mediterranean, a fragile and wild creature dancing in the wind. Its petals, the finest paper whisper of white, pale pink, or a deep, almost violet color, trembling in the dry wind that carried the salt of a distant sea and the dust of nascent civilizations. Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing poppy, a Latin name it was destined to justify millions of times, a name that became synonymous with both divine relief and diabolical destruction. It was here long before the empires it would first build and then paralyze, long before the armies it would first heal and then destroy. There were only scattered groups of people whose knuckles still remembered the coarseness of a stone axe, and whose collective mind was just beginning to weave the complex, uncertain tapestry of agriculture. Sometime in the fog of the 6th millennium BC, in the soft, yielding soil of the Fertile Crescent, these Neolithic farmers, our distant and perpetually weary ancestors, noticed this particular flower. Perhaps their eyes, accustomed to spotting predators in the tall grass, observed the strange behavior of mountain goats, which with dull persistence chewed the unripe green pods and froze in a blissful stupor, their anxieties about wolves and hunger dissolving into a deep, supernatural indifference. Or perhaps a curious child, led by the eternal search for the edible, broke open a firm green pod and licked the bitter, milky sap oozing from the inflicted wound, feeling on the tip of their tongue the first incomprehensible yet sweet touch of oblivion. However it happened, this accidental discovery became a quiet but fundamental revolution, changing humanity's relationship with pain. They learned to cultivate it, selecting the plants with the largest, most swollen pods, those that wept the most potent, milky tears, and planting them closer to their first wattle and daub dwellings. They mastered the simple, almost meditative art of its harvest, a ritual honed to perfection through thousands of repetitions. After the bright ephemeral petals fell away, revealing the green capsule, they waited for the perfect moment, when the crowned head would swell with juice but had not yet begun to dry under the scorching sun. Then, with a sharp shard of flint or obsidian, they would make shallow, precise incisions, and almost immediately a thick white latex would begin to ooze out, gathering on the surface in shiny beads. Exposed to the warm air, it slowly oxidized, darkened, turning into a sticky, brownish-black resin, the raw material of dreams, concentrated silence packaged in a lump of gum. This was opium. They scraped it from the pods with special spatulas, rolled it into balls, and stored it as their greatest treasure, more valuable than any polished jade or rare seashell. Archaeological excavations at Neolithic lake dwellings in Switzerland have uncovered thousands of charred poppy seeds, proving that this plant was not just known, but systematically cultivated, becoming part of their diet, their first pharmacy, and their first curse. From these humble agrarian beginnings, the poppy began its inexorable, triumphant march into the very heart of civilization. On the sun-scorched, cracked plains of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, architects of writing and the wheel, cultivated it with a reverence bordering on religious worship. On their cuneiform clay tablets, dated to around 3400 BC, they gave it a name that resonates with a childlike, innocent wonder, Gil, meaning joy plant. For them, it was not just a flower, but a gift from the gods, a direct line of communication with the divine, a way to touch eternity. Priests in the high ziggurats used it in sacred rituals as a smoky incense carrying prayers aloft in clouds of fragrant smoke, or as an ingredient in a drink that opened the mind to the whispers of the heavens. It was a tool to quell the existential terror of a people living at the mercy of capricious rivers and even more capricious deities. It eased the unbearable pain of childbirth and quieted the dry, lung-tearing cough of the dying, offering a fleeting, blissful escape from a harsh and short life. The joy plant was woven into the very fabric of their society, a sacred medicine and a holy sacrament, the line between them thin and permeable. Knowledge, like the waters of the Nile, flowed down the stream of time into Egypt. The great physicians of the New Kingdom, who compiled their wisdom in the famous Ebers Papyrus around 1550 BC, were well acquainted with the power of the poppy. They no longer simply worshipped it. They prescribed opium with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon using a scalpel against diseased flesh. It was a key ingredient in complex mixtures for treating eye diseases, for settling the ever-rebellious gut, and, in a recipe that exudes a chilling practicality, to stop the excessive crying of children. Imagine an exhausted mother in ancient Thebes giving her screaming infant a dose of this medicine, bringing a blessed, unnatural silence to her mud-brick home. The city of Thebes itself became a center of poppy cultivation, its fields, known throughout the region as Thebaicum, producing the highest quality opium, which became an important export. Packed in distinctive amphorae, it sailed on swift Phoenician ships across the sparkling expanse of the Mediterranean, reaching every port where people suffered from pain. It was not just a commodity, but an extension of Egyptian influence, a soft power that could soothe the toothache of a Hittite king or ensure the peaceful sleep of a Mycenaean aristocrat. The poppy was an instrument of diplomacy and power, wrapped in the sweet promise of peace and oblivion. The poppy found a particularly warm welcome among the brilliant civilizations of the Aegean. On Crete, the vibrant, cheerful Minoan culture, which flourished 2,000 years before Christ, placed the poppy at the very center of its spiritual world, making it an attribute of a deity. Archaeologists on Crete have discovered a small but striking terracotta figurine of a goddess or priestess. Her eyes are wide open in a state of trance, and her intricate hairstyle or diadem is pierced by 3 perfectly rendered opium poppy pods, like divine antennae picking up signals from the world of dreams and eternity. She is the poppy goddess, a deity of sleep, healing, and the gentle, painless transition from this world to the next. Here, the poppy was the embodiment of the divine feminine, a source of healing and oblivion, the promise of a quiet departure without suffering, a final comfort. On mainland Greece, its presence was more complex and multifaceted. The great Homer, in the Odyssey, speaks of the mysterious drug nepenthe, which Helen of Troy mixed into the wine of the grieving Telemachus, a substance capable of banishing all pain, anger, and sorrow, and bringing forgetfulness of all ills. Most scholars agree that this was wine heavily laced with opium, a drink that made the horrors of the Trojan War and the pangs of recent loss simply disappear into a thick fog of euphoria. This was the first literary evidence of opium being used not for physical pain, but for emotional anguish, for wounds not visible to the eye. Later, the father of medicine himself, Hippocrates, approached opium with the cool caution of a scientist. He decisively rejected magical thinking and superstitions, cataloging its practical applications: hypnotic, narcotic, styptic. He recognized its immense value in the hands of a physician, but also saw its dark side, its ability to enslave. But even as Hippocrates tried to medicalize opium, it retained its mystical, otherworldly aura. It was almost certainly used in the secret Eleusinian mysteries, where initiates sought ecstatic communion with the goddesses Demeter and Persephone by consuming the sacred drink kykeon, which likely contained a small dose of opium to induce visions and spiritual insight. The Greeks, like no other, understood the duality of opium. It could be a precise tool in the hands of a physician or a key unlocking the hidden doors of perception in the hands of a priest. This fundamental duality would haunt it throughout its long and bloody history. When Rome conquered Greece, it absorbed not only its territories and art, but also its pharmacopoeia. The Romans, with their innate genius for organization, logistics, and mass production, took the cultivation and trade of opium to a completely new imperial level. Opium became an integral and commonplace part of Roman life. The great physician Galen of Pergamon, who served several Roman emperors, including Marcus Aurelius, praised it as the most powerful of all analgesics, the instrument of the gods. He perfected complex medicinal mixtures, the famous theriacs, in which opium was an indispensable ingredient, sold throughout the vast empire, from Britain to Syria. Citizens, from senators in snow-white togas to legionaries in dusty sandals, could buy it in the markets to alleviate their numerous ailments or simply to escape the noise, stench, and squalor of overcrowded Rome. The Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius himself, the philosopher on the throne, was a regular user, taking a small dose of an opium drink every evening to soothe his chronic chest and stomach pains and to ensure sleep. Under the rule of the pragmatic Romans, the joy plant completed its first great transformation, from a sacred flower to a physician's tool, and then to a mundane commodity, a solace for the masses and a profitable business for the empire. Its long journey, however, was just beginning. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the great libraries of classical knowledge were plundered or burned. The complex medical wisdom of Galen and Hippocrates became a ghost in Europe, and the well-established supply chains of high-quality opium from Egypt and Asia Minor disintegrated, turning to dust along with the aqueducts and roads. The West entered a long period of medical stagnation, where prayer once again became the main analgesic, and surgery reverted to the level of torture. But the flame of knowledge was not extinguished. It was carefully carried eastward to a new and brilliant civilization rising from the sands of Arabia, the Islamic Golden Age. In the magnificent House of Wisdom in Baghdad, Arab, Persian, and Syriac, scholars tirelessly translated Greek texts into Arabic, saving them from oblivion. But they did not merely preserve, they researched, collated, refined, and expanded upon this knowledge with their own observations and experiments. Islamic physicians subjected opium to rigorous scientific study, free from superstition. The brilliant clinician Al-Razi pioneered the use of opium as an anesthetic, developing sponges soaked in a narcotic mixture that were held to the patient's face, allowing for complex surgeries unimaginable in Europe at the time. But the most outstanding figure of this era was the Persian polymath Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. His encyclopedic work, The Canon of Medicine, was a breathtaking synthesis of all known medical knowledge. In it, he gave the most detailed and complex analysis of opium to date. He meticulously catalogued its virtues, but he was also the first to systematically document its dark side. Avicenna, with stark clarity and prophetic accuracy, warned of its potential to cause lethargy, respiratory depression, and, most importantly, addiction, the terrible, irresistible craving it could instill in those who used it unwisely. While the scholars of Baghdad and Cordoba refined the science of opium, Arab merchants, masters of the long-distance caravan routes, disseminated the substance itself. Opium, pressed into dark, dense cakes smelling of bitter herbs, became a precious cargo on the legendary Silk Road. Imagine the slow, meditative gait of a camel caravan, bells tinkling softly in the vast, ringing silence of the Central Asian steppe. In their bales, alongside iridescent silks and fragrant spices, lay the bricks of dried poppy juice, traveling from the Levant to Samarkand and Bukhara. The Silk Road was not just a conduit for goods, it was an artery for ideas, religions, and pharmacology. And it was this route that carried opium to the next fateful stage of its journey, to India, where it found its second, even more fertile home. In the warm, fertile lands of the Indian subcontinent, particularly in Bengal and Malwa, the poppy found its ideal climate and soil. Soon, vast fields of white, pink, and purple flowers bloomed under the hot Indian sun, swaying in the wind like a living sea. The Mughal emperors, aesthetes, and hedonists embraced opium not just as a medicine, but as a refined luxury, a tool for contemplation and subtle pleasure. They consumed it as a drink called doda, or ate it as a powder mixed with spices to enhance poetic inspiration, or simply to drift into a state of serene, detached euphoria. Under their lavish patronage, India became a major center of opium production, and its reach was about to extend even further east, to the shores of the largest, wealthiest, and proudest empire on earth. Arab, and later Portuguese, merchants were the first to bring opium to the bustling ports of Ming Dynasty China. For centuries, it remained an overseas curiosity, an exotic and very expensive medicine imported in negligible quantities. The Chinese, like other peoples before them, preferred to eat it, and in this form, its effects were slow, mild, and addiction was extremely rare. For the educated elite, it was a rare indulgence, a symbol of status and sophistication. No one, not a single sage or astrologer, could have predicted the alchemical reaction that was about to occur, a reaction that would transform this panacea into an all-consuming social poison. The catalyst for this explosion came from the other side of the world, from the New World. It was tobacco. The arrival of tobacco in China, introduced by European sailors in the early 17th century, sparked a nationwide smoking craze. Alarmed by what he saw as a decadent new vice, the last Ming emperor banned it in 1639. Like many prohibitions throughout history, it had the opposite effect. Demand went underground, and enterprising merchants, seeking ways to disguise their illicit product, began mixing tobacco with other substances. The most popular, most potent, and most profitable mixture proved to be tobacco blended with opium, a concoction known as madak. This shift from ingesting opium to smoking it changed everything. When smoked, the vapor was absorbed directly into the bloodstream through the vast surface area of the lungs, delivering the psychoactive alkaloids to the brain in seconds. The result was a sudden, intense wave of euphoria, a rush far more powerful and compelling than anything that could be achieved by eating the drug. This new delivery method maximized its addictive potential, creating a near-instant neurological prison from which escape was agonizingly difficult. Madak became a sensation, and enthusiasts soon refined the process, removing the tobacco and learning to smoke pure opium paste, or chandu. This gave rise to a new ritual, new paraphernalia, and a new social institution, the opium den. In the 18th century, these were often tranquil, almost meditative establishments, where patrons reclined on communal platforms, the only sounds the soft bubbling of the long pipes and the crackle of the lamp. Here, time slowed to a thick syrup, and all the cares of the outside world dissolved into the fragrant, sweet-smelling haze. It was an escape, seductive beyond measure. What began as a rough habit of sailors and dock workers soon climbed the social ladder, snaring soldiers, merchants, Mandarin officials, and even scholars. By the mid-18th century, addiction was a visible, creeping epidemic, undermining the Confucian values of diligence, filial duty, and moderation that formed the very bedrock of the Qing state. The Yongjing Emperor issued the first-ever anti-opium edict in 1729, but the trade was too lucrative and the corruption among officials too deep. The edict merely drove the trade further into the shadows, creating a vast and thriving black market. China had a festering wound, a homegrown crisis that was slowly paralyzing its people. But the wound was about to be lanced with a crude surgical knife. On the horizon were the white sails of the British East India Company ships, and they were bringing opium not by the chest, but by the flotilla. The problem was silver, a simple, elegant, and utterly ruinous problem for the British Empire. For decades, Britain, and in particular its most powerful corporate entity, the British East India Company, had an insatiable, almost narcotic craving for Chinese goods. Tea, primarily, but also silk and porcelain. London and all of Europe lusted after these things, but the Qing dynasty, self-sufficient in its ancient economic rhythms, wanted almost nothing in return that industrial England could offer. For every chest of tea unloaded at the London docks, a chest of pure silver had to be shipped to Canton. The trade imbalance was colossal, an economic hemorrhage of precious metal that threatened the financial stability of the British Empire. A solution had to be found. Not a diplomatic one, but a commercial one. A new product was required, one the Chinese didn't yet know they needed, but which they would soon be unable to live without. And there, in the fertile fields of Bengal, under the hot Indian sun, that solution was growing by the millions of flowers. Poppies, acres and acres of poppies. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company became the de facto sovereign of Bengal, gaining control over the perfect soil for cultivating Papaver somniferum. The company, a marvel of bureaucratic efficiency and corporate ruthlessness, established a complete, total monopoly. It was a planned economy built around a single narcotic commodity. Company agents issued advances to local farmers, coercing them to grow poppies instead of rice and other food crops, driving entire villages into debt bondage. At the company's vast factories in Patna and Benares, the raw opium was refined, tested for purity, and pressed into dense, round cakes weighing about 1.5 kilograms, which were then packed into standardized wooden chests lined with hides. The final product was high-quality, exceptionally potent opium, a brand recognized and prized in the dens of Canton. The company, hypocritically maintaining a fiction of legality, did not officially sell opium to China. Instead, it held grand auctions in Calcutta, where private merchants, mostly British, known as country traders, bought the drug on credit. These traders, adventurers, and future tycoons like William Jardine and James Matheson would transport the opium to the Chinese coast on their swift, gull-like clippers, acting as frontmen. With the proceeds from these auctions, the company then purchased tea in Canton, closing the diabolical circle. Silver no longer flowed out of London, now it poured out of China in a river. It was a perfect, closed, and utterly devastating trade triangle. The corporate engine of the British Empire was humming, and its fuel was the addiction of an entire nation. For the Daoguang Emperor, ruling from the gilded silence of the Forbidden City, the dispatches from the south were a grim chronicle of decay. The problem was no longer merely economic. The silver drain was hollowing out the treasury. It had become a moral, a spiritual sickness that was eviscerating his kingdom from within. From the peasant selling his last plow to the elite Manchu bannerman whose hand trembled on his spear, the pipe had become master. Imperial edicts were toothless in the face of pervasive corruption. Officials sent to combat the trade became its biggest players themselves. In 1838, after much vacillation, the emperor made his choice. He sided with the hardliners and summoned a man renowned for his legendary efficiency and unwavering, almost puritanical moral integrity. His name was Lin Zexu. Appointed Imperial High Commissioner, he arrived in Canton in early 1839 as a man on a holy mission, vested with extraordinary powers. He would not take bribes, he would not compromise. He arrested over 1,600 Chinese dealers, established clinics to rehabilitate addicts, and launched a brilliant public information campaign, even penning an eloquent but undelivered letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her conscience and asking how she would feel if foreigners brought poison to her own country. Having set his own house in order, Lin turned his steel-eyed gaze on the foreign merchants in their isolated enclave, the 13 factories on the banks of the Pearl River. He demanded they surrender all their opium. When they arrogantly refused, Lin acted with calculated, cold force. He surrounded the factories with troops, blockaded the river with his junks, and cut off all food and water supplies. Several hundred foreigners, accustomed to luxury and servants, were suddenly prisoners in a sweltering, humid jail. The British Superintendent of Trade, Captain Charles Elliot, trapped and with no way out, ordered the merchants to surrender their opium, but with one key, fateful promise. The British government would cover all their losses. With the stroke of a pen, he had transformed a dispute over private smuggling into a matter of state, writing a check that could only be cashed by the cannons of the Royal Navy. Over 6 weeks, a staggering quantity, more than 20,000 chests of opium, over 1,200 tons of the drug, was delivered to the shore. Lin Zexu had won. He could have sold it and replenished the treasury, but instead, he opted for a grand act of symbolic national purification. On the beach at Human, he ordered 3 vast trenches to be dug. The opium was mixed with salt and lime, flooded with seawater, and for 23 days, laborers churned the toxic slurry with long poles before it was flushed into the South China Sea. Lin had upheld the law and the emperor's moral authority. But in London, the news of the destruction of millions of pounds worth of British property was being spun into a carefully orchestrated narrative of national humiliation. The lobbyists, led by Jardine, now a member of Parliament, cast themselves as respectable merchants robbed by a barbaric and tyrannical government. The debate in Parliament was not about the morality of the drug trade, but about the principles of free trade and national honor. Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, a hawk and an imperialist to the core, argued forcefully for war. An expeditionary force was dispatched, not to negotiate, but to punish. The roar of cannons was to replace the quiet exchange of silver for tea. The First Opium War was not just a clash of 2 armies, it was a clash of 2 different centuries, 2 different realities. The Qing dynasty possessed a vast but pre-industrial army, armed with matchlock muskets, spears, and bows, and a fleet of hundreds of wooden junks, formidable in close combat but powerless at a distance. The British, however, brought with them all the concentrated power of the Industrial Revolution: percussion cap muskets that were many times faster to load, superior rifled artillery, and their most decisive game-changing weapon, the steamship. The symbol of the entire conflict was the Nemesis, the world's first ocean-going iron-hulled steamship, built with the private funds of the East India Company. With its shallow draft, it was practically invulnerable to the round Chinese cannonballs, which simply bounced off its iron sides, and it could travel up rivers, bypassing coastal fortifications and getting behind the enemy. It was a mobile artillery platform of terrifying efficiency, a specter from an industrial hell invading an ancient contemplative world. The war began in mid-1840, not with a grand battle, but with a series of surgically precise, humiliating strikes. The British fleet, realizing the futility of a frontal assault on the heavily fortified Canton, bypassed it, capturing Zhoushan Island as a northern base, and then systematically dismantled the defenses of the Pearl River Delta. The Bogue forts, formidable stone structures, were designed to fire out to sea. The Nemesis and other steamships simply sailed past them and landed troops, capturing them from the rear. The technological gap was not just a gap, but an abyss. In one engagement, a fleet of 15 junks, loaded with brave warriors, desperately attacked a single British steamship, and their cannonballs bounced harmlessly off its iron hull while it methodically fired upon them with explosive shells, turning wood and flesh into a bloody mess. The most destructive phase of the war began when the British decided to strike at the economic jugular of the Qing Empire, the great Yangtze River. In the summer of 1842, a British fleet of more than 70 ships, including several steamships, forced its way up the river, a main artery of commerce that intersected with the Grand Canal, which transported vital grain and taxes from the south to the capital, Beijing. By capturing the key city of Zhenjiang at their intersection, the British could effectively starve the capital, bringing the empire to its knees. The battle for Zhenjiang was one of the most brutal and tragic of the war. The Manchu garrison, understanding the strategic importance of the city, fought with desperate, fanatical bravery, street by street, house by house. But bravery was powerless against technology and discipline. When the city fell, the Manchu general, seeing that all was lost, calmly returned to his headquarters, sat in a chair, and ordered his servants to set the building on fire, making a fiery sacrifice of himself so as not to be taken prisoner by the barbarians. The fall of Zhenjiang broke the will of the Daoguang emperor. His capital was cut off from food, his armies were defeated, and the British fleet threatened the ancient southern capital, Nanjing. He had no choice but to sue for peace. The war that had begun over opium destroyed on a beach was over. Gunboats had silenced imperial edicts, and the opium smoke rising from 1 million pipes across China now mingled with the black, greasy smoke belching from the funnels of British steamships. The old world had been shattered, and a new, unequal relationship was about to be dictated by terms as bitter as opium resin. The cannons fell silent. On August 29, 1842, aboard the British flagship HMS Cornwallis, anchored on the Yangtze River at Nanjing, a carefully orchestrated ceremony of humiliation unfolded. On one side were the confident, sun-tanned British officers in their dress uniforms, led by Sir Henry Pottinger, a man who had come to dictate, not to negotiate. On the other were the Qing commissioners, pale, haggard Confucian scholars in their silk robes, faced with the crude, irrefutable arithmetic of military defeat. The document that lay between them was not a treaty between equals, but an invoice for a war China had never wanted and which it had lost. This was the Treaty of Nanking, a masterpiece of imperial exploitation. First, the money, a staggering indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, a sum that included payment for the destroyed opium, the debts of Chinese merchants, and the full cost of the British military expedition itself. China was being forced to pay for its own conquest. Second, the land, the small, rocky, and almost uninhabited island of Hong Kong, was ceded to Britain in perpetuity, becoming a strategic foothold, a gateway to China, and a permanent unhealing wound on the body of the Celestial Empire. But the true genius of the treaty lay in the complete dismantling of the old Canton system, which had restrained foreign influence for centuries. 5 new treaty ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and the future giant Shanghai, were forcibly opened to British commerce, a strategic injection of foreign influence into China's most sensitive coastal arteries. And to guarantee impunity and humiliate Chinese sovereignty, the treaty introduced the concept of extraterritoriality. A British subject who committed a crime on Chinese soil would henceforth not be subject to Chinese courts, but would be tried under British law. The Son of Heaven was no longer the ultimate authority in his own empire. The Qing officials signed. Their brushes, accustomed to tracing elegant characters, trembled, but they had no choice. This scrap of paper was the first and most important of the unequal treaties. It set a precedent and showed the world that the ancient, proud empire was vulnerable. It was a kicked-in door, and soon the Americans, the French, and other European powers would pour through it, demanding their own privileges. This was the formal beginning of what Chinese historians would call the Century of Humiliation, a long, agonizing twilight from which the country would not begin to emerge for another 100 years. The peace established at Nanking was nothing more than a fragile, tense pause. The opium trade, hypocritically not even mentioned in the treaty, did not just continue but exploded, now through the newly opened ports, siphoning off the nation's silver and vitality with renewed vigor. The scar of Nanking festered. The appetite of the Western empires was insatiable. Britain wanted more ports, unrestricted access to the interior, and, most humiliatingly, the right to have a permanent ambassador in Peking on equal footing with the emperor. All that was needed was a pretext to finish what had been started. In October 1856, it arrived in the form of a small vessel called the Arrow. It was a Chinese-owned ship, temporarily registered in Hong Kong for the convenience of smuggling. When Chinese officials arrested several crew members on suspicion of piracy, the belligerent British consul in Canton, Harry Parkes, claimed it was an insult to the British flag, although the flag was most likely not even flying at the time. It was enough. The insult was fabricated, the outrage manufactured, and the gunboats were called in again. This time, the British were joined by the French, eager for colonial prestige and glory. Their pretext was even more contrived: the execution of a French missionary who had been illegally preaching in the interior. Thus began the Second Opium War, essentially a repeat of the first, but on a grander, more brutal, and more cynical scale. Anglo-French forces captured Canton and moved north, their steam-powered gunboats sweeping aside the outdated Qing armies. The Xianfeng emperor, weak and indecisive, vacillating between fighting and negotiating, made a fatal mistake. His men seized and brutally tortured a British diplomatic party that had arrived under a flag of truce. For the British commander, Lord Elgin, son of the same Elgin who had removed the Parthenon marbles, this was the final straw, an act of unthinkable barbarism that demanded a terrible symbolic punishment. When his troops reached the outskirts of Beijing, they found their target, Yuanming Yuan, the Gardens of Perfect Brightness, or as it was known in the West, the Old Summer Palace. This was not just a palace, but a vast, sprawling complex covering hundreds of hectares, filled with exquisite pavilions, temples, pagodas, and libraries, the heart of the Qing dynasty, the repository of the most magnificent art collection in China, assembled over centuries. What happened next was not an act of war, but an act of organized, barbaric plunder. For 2 days, British and French soldiers ran amok through the gardens, smashing lacquer cabinets with axes, prying jewels from thrones with their bayonets, and stuffing their pockets with priceless porcelain, jade, and silk scrolls. But the looting was only a prelude. On October 18, 1860, Lord Elgin gave the order. British soldiers entered Yuanmingyuan with torches. For 3 days, the magnificent wooden palaces, masterpieces of architecture, burned. Thick black smoke blotted out the sun over Beijing, and the sky rained down on the capital the ashes of 1,000 years of art and irreplaceable books. It was a profound act of cultural genocide, an attempt to erase memory and humiliate the spirit of a nation. The broken emperor fled the capital and soon accepted the even more humiliating Convention of Peking. The opium trade was fully legalized, new ports were opened, and new giant indemnities were imposed. The war was over. The British and French had gotten everything they wanted. But in the process of prying open China, they had set its soul on fire. The embers of the Summer Palace would smolder in the Chinese consciousness for a century, a symbol of deep, brutal, and unforgettable humiliation. While the guns of the Royal Navy were breaking down the gates of China and French soldiers were plundering its treasures, another flag, the Stars and Stripes, was becoming an increasingly familiar sight in the murky waters of the Pearl River Delta. The Americans were there too. In popular American history, their role in this sordid trade is often written out or downplayed, but in reality, their involvement in the opium trade was quiet, cunning, and fantastically profitable. They were master traders, and opium was just another commodity in their ledgers. Morality was a concern for the preachers back home. In Canton, only profit mattered. The Americans found their source not in British Bengal, but in the poppy fields of the Ottoman Empire, becoming the primary smugglers of high-quality but expensive Turkish opium. This trade was not conducted by pirates or adventurers, but by the most respectable merchant families of New England, the so-called Boston Brahmins, whose names would later adorn the halls of Harvard, hospitals, and philharmonics. Their initial dynastic capital was woven from the sticky tears of the opium poppy. Warren Delano Jr., the grandfather of future President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, made his vast fortune at Russell & Company, the largest American trading firm in Canton, whose most profitable business was the illegal importation of opium. He personally considered the trade fair, honorable, and legitimate, merely circumventing an irrational and barbaric Chinese prohibition. His enormous profits became the foundation of the Delano family's influence for generations to come. The Forbes family, another illustrious Boston clan, also got its start in opium. John Murray Forbes managed the fast clippers that raced from Smyrna to China, and he turned his drug profits into a vast empire of railroads and finance that helped build America. The money, laundered by time and respectable investments, became the foundation of the New England elite. The Perkins, Cabot, and Lowe families all were deeply involved in a trade that sowed destruction and death on the other side of the world, but built palaces and libraries in Boston. Their operation was a masterclass in logistics. Opium was procured in Smyrna, transported on the world's fastest clippers, and sold to Chinese smugglers from floating warehouse ships anchored in international waters. The resulting silver was used to buy tea and silk for the American market, a perfect self-sustaining trade triangle. During the First Opium War, the U.S., while maintaining official neutrality, happily seized a share of the British market, profiting from the war, without firing a single shot. But history, as it often does, came back like a boomerang. After the wars and the gold rush, thousands of Chinese immigrants poured into California, building railroads with the money of those same Forbeses. They brought with them the solace of the opium pipe. The vice, so profitably exported to China, had established a beachhead in America itself. Opium dens appeared in the Chinatowns of San Francisco and other cities, and what was considered a Chinese problem began to seep into American society, giving rise to fear, a racist moral panic, and the country's first wave of anti-drug legislation. The Yankee traders, without realizing it, had brought the seeds of a narcotic plague to their own shores. While the poppy bled for the imperial coffers in the East, its ghost had long and firmly haunted the West, but not in a smoky, exotic opium den, but in a small, respectable glass bottle with a ground glass stopper. This ghost was called laudanum, a simple yet brilliant preparation, opium dissolved in alcohol. Throughout the 19th century, it was an angel in a bottle, the great panacea of the industrial age, a cure for all ailments. It was sold without a prescription in any pharmacy, was cheaper than gin, and more reliable than prayer. For an exhausted working-class mother in the squalid slums of Manchester or Liverpool, a few drops of laudanum added to milk would soothe an infant crying from hunger and illness. Products like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup were in every home, and an entire quiet, docile generation was raised on opium, while infant mortality from accidental overdoses was a silent, unacknowledged catastrophe. But this was not only a problem of the poor. In the respectable drawing rooms of the Victorian era, laudanum was a crutch for the weaker sex. To women suffering from vague diagnoses like hysteria, melancholia, or neurasthenia, in essence, from boredom, depression, and a lack of rights, doctors prescribed it en masse as a calming tonic. The ideal Victorian wife, serene, calm, and submissive, was often a woman maintained in a state of constant opiate intoxication. It was a chemical corset for the female mind. The literary world was literally saturated with it. Thomas de Quincey wrote his famous Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Samuel Taylor Coleridge created his mystical Kubla Khan in an opium dream. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the Bronte sisters, Edgar Allan Poe, the list of creative minds who relied on the divine potion for inspiration and pain relief is enormous. The scale of this quiet domestic addiction was colossal. The average per capita opium consumption in Britain and the USA at the end of the 19th century significantly exceeded even that of China. During the American Civil War, morphine, a pure alkaloid isolated from opium in 1804, was so generously distributed to the wounded that the resulting addiction became known as the soldier's disease. The invention of the hypodermic syringe in the 1850s only exacerbated the problem, creating a faster and more efficient addict. By the end of the 19th century, the medical community finally realized with horror the scale of the crisis it had helped to create. The angel in a bottle was finally recognized as a demon. The doctors who had so generously prescribed it were now desperately searching for a cure for the addiction they themselves had cultivated. The stage was set for a new scientific miracle, a solution born in a test tube. The world needed a hero, and in an impeccably clean German laboratory, he was about to be synthesized. The setting was Elberfeld, Germany, in the year 1897. In the gleamingly clean laboratories of the pharmaceutical giant Bayer, a young, talented chemist named Felix Hoffmann was working on creating a less irritating form of salicylic acid to treat his father's rheumatism, and succeeded brilliantly, creating acetyl salicylic acid, or aspirin. But on his workbench, another darker experiment was also underway. The target was morphine. Bayer, like all pharmaceutical companies of the time, was chasing the Holy Grail, a painkiller as powerful as morphine, but without its terrifying addictive grip. The company was especially searching for an effective and safe cough suppressant, as tuberculosis and pneumonia were the era's top killers. Hoffmann, working under the direction of the head of the pharmacology department, Heinrich Draeser, took morphine and subjected it to a simple process of acetylation, creating a new substance, diacetylmorphine. Initial tests on animals and factory workers were astonishing. The compound was a phenomenally effective cough suppressant, many times stronger than codeine, and seemed to induce a sense of well-being and euphoria in the subjects. Dresser was ecstatic. Based on this extremely limited and deeply flawed research, he confidently declared that diacetylmorphine was not only more effective than morphine, but, crucially, was non-addictive. He even promoted it as a cure for morphine addiction itself. All that was needed was a catchy, memorable name. The drug made users feel strong, powerful, even heroic. So Bayer's marketing department christened it heroin. In 1898, the company launched one of the most ambitious and, as it turned out, destructive marketing campaigns in history. Heroin was marketed worldwide as a safe, non-addictive substitute for morphine and a miracle cough cure for children and adults. Doctors, desperate for a solution to the morphine crisis they themselves had created, embraced it with open arms. But soon, alarming reports began to pour in from around the world. Patients were developing a new, much faster and more insatiable addiction, and the withdrawal symptoms were exponentially worse than those of morphine. The terrible truth of the chemistry became clear. The two acetyl groups did not weaken, but, on the contrary, enhanced morphine's effects, making it more fat-soluble and allowing it to cross the blood-brain barrier with lightning speed. Bayer hadn't created a cure. It had created a chemical Trojan horse, a perfect delivery system for morphine to the brain. By the early 1900s, the dream had evaporated, turning into a nightmare. Bayer quietly ceased production in 1913, but the damage was done. The genie wasn't just out of the bottle. It had been weaponized, commercialized, and distributed across the globe. The chemical children of the poppy were out of control. It was a global plague, and it became clear that no single nation could contain it alone. The world was slowly, reluctantly, and far too late, beginning to awaken to the reality. The catalyst for this global awakening came from an unexpected quarter, the United States, a nation that, after the Spanish-American War of 1898, had acquired the Philippines, and with them a problem inherited from the Spanish, a state-licensed opium monopoly. For the American government, steeped in the spirit of progressivism and Protestant moralism, this was intolerable. An Episcopal missionary named Charles Henry Brent, who worked in the Philippines and saw firsthand the debilitating effects of addiction, became a tireless crusader, arguing that the U.S. had a moral obligation to lead an international movement against the drug trade. His passionate appeals resonated with President Theodore Roosevelt, who saw a perfect opportunity to assert America's new international status, curry favor with China, which had its own scores to settle with opium, and exert moral pressure on the old colonial powers, especially Great Britain, which was still reaping huge profits from opium exports from India. It was a perfect marriage of sincere idealism and cold geopolitics. The first step was the Shanghai Opium Commission of 1909, where 13 nations sat down at the same table for the first time to discuss drugs as a common problem. The Americans insisted on moral condemnation, the Chinese pleaded for help, and the British, the biggest traders in the room, fiercely defended their medicinal exports. The commission ended with vague, non-binding resolutions, but it had placed the issue on the global agenda. This momentum led to the Hague International Opium Convention of 1912, the first ever attempt to create a global drug control treaty. The negotiations were difficult, fraught with national interests and corporate lobbying, but the final document was a masterpiece of compromise. It obligated signatory nations to control the production and distribution of raw opium, to gradually suppress its non-medical smoking, and, crucially, it imposed strict controls on its derivatives: medicinal opium, morphine, cocaine, and, named for the first time in international law, heroin. The production and trade of these substances were to be limited to exclusively medical and legitimate purposes. The convention established the fundamental principle that would define global drug policy for the next century: the division between licit medical use and illicit recreational use. However, its immediate impact was limited. Ratification was slow, and the treaty had no real enforcement mechanism. And just as the fragile gears of this new international machine began to turn, the world plunged into the darkness of the First World War. The spirit of international cooperation evaporated, and morphine and heroin were required on an industrial scale to treat the millions wounded on the fields of Flanders and Verdun, creating a new, even larger generation of addicts. The world's first attempt to rein in the empire of the poppy was postponed indefinitely, drowned out by the deafening roar of artillery. The great colonial empires, weakened by 2 world wars, collapsed, leaving behind a power vacuum and chaos on their former peripheries. New men stepped into this vacuum, not diplomats or merchants, but men with guns, ambition, and a deep understanding of the brutal arithmetic of the poppy. The stage for a new, bloody act of this drama became the Golden Triangle, a harsh, rugged, fog-shrouded mountainous territory where the borders of Burma, Thailand, and Laos converge. A smuggler's dream, a government's hell. The catalyst was the victory of Mao Zedong's communists in China in 1949. The remnants of the defeated nationalist Kuomintang (KMT) army fled across the border into the wild mountains of Burma's Shan state. In Washington, where Cold War paranoia was already raging, the CIA saw in this ghost army an ideal proxy force, a secret dagger against Red China. Under Operation Paper, the CIA began to secretly supply the KMT remnants with weapons, ammunition, and advisors. But armies need money, and CIA funding was meager and irregular. The KMT needed its own business model, and all around them, on the scorched slopes that local hill tribes had cultivated for centuries, the poppy bloomed. The KMT commanders, battle-hardened realists, quickly organized the scattered peasant cultivation into a highly efficient, vertically integrated industry. They imposed a poppy tax, established mobile laboratories to refine raw opium into morphine base, and for heroin, and organized vast mule caravans to transport it to the Thai border, where corrupt Thai military and police officials, key U.S. anti-communist allies, gladly turned a blind eye in exchange for a share of the profits. The Golden Triangle was born not of ancient tradition, but of modern geopolitics. It was a narco-state forged in the crucible of the Cold War, a secret enterprise indirectly supported by America's war on communism. The irony was exquisite and deadly. While America officially worried about the rise of drug addiction at home, its own intelligence agency had become the midwife to the world's largest heroin syndicate. Geopolitically, the operation to destabilize China failed, but as a business, it was a staggering success. Then, the escalation of the conflict in Vietnam and the CIA's secret war in Laos added more fuel to this fire. The CIA's legendary airline, Air America, which delivered weapons and supplies to anti-communist allies like the Hmong Army, often carried opium on its return flights, which flowed into the same processing and distribution networks. This geopolitical chaos allowed local warlords to emerge, the most formidable and famous of whom was Khun Sa, a charismatic and ruthless leader who built his own drug empire with his own army, at his peak controlling up to 70% of all heroin coming from the region. By the time hundreds of thousands of American soldiers were fighting in Vietnam, cheap and incredibly pure heroin from the Golden Triangle had flooded Saigon, and addiction rates among soldiers skyrocketed. The war had come full circle. The secret operations designed to contain communism had nurtured a product that was incapacitating and killing the very soldiers sent to fight for it. The dragon had begun to eat its own tail. But all kingdoms, even narco-kingdoms, fall. In the 1980s, under growing pressure from the U.S., which was facing a heroin epidemic at home, the Thai government began to shut down smuggling routes, and the Burmese army began to push back against the warlords in Shan State. Production in the Golden Triangle became riskier and less profitable, and just as one door for the Poppy Empire began to slowly close, another, on the other side of the world, was about to be kicked open by a Soviet soldier's boot. The flower is patient. It found new, even more ideal soil, the high, desolate plains and jagged, impregnable mountains of Afghanistan. On Christmas Eve 1979, the Soviet Union rolled tanks into Afghanistan to prop up a failing communist government and walked into a decade-long bloody nightmare, its own Vietnam. The Afghan resistance rose up, the Mujahideen, the Holy Warriors. Washington once again saw a perfect opportunity to bleed its main rival. Under Operation Cyclone, one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in history, the CIA began funneling billions of dollars in weapons and funding through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, which distributed it to the most radical and effective Mujahideen commanders. But the CIA provided guns, not salaries. The salaries were provided by the Poppy. The conditions were perfect. The war had completely destroyed the fragile legal economy, but left the basic infrastructure intact. Farmers, unable to sell their wheat, switched to opium, the perfect wartime cash crop, light, non-perishable, and incredibly expensive. Mujahideen commanders encouraged its cultivation, taxed the harvest, and protected the smuggling routes. Heroin labs sprang up like mushrooms in the lawless tribal areas of Pakistan under the protection of the same ISI agents who were distributing American weapons. The Khyber Pass became a two-way street. Weapons went in one direction, heroin in the other. The scale of the transformation was both breathtaking and terrifying. If in 1979 Afghanistan produced about 100 tons of opium a year, by the end of the Soviet occupation in 1989, it was producing thousands of tons. It had become the undisputed world leader, the Saudi Arabia of opium, supplying the majority of heroin to Europe and, increasingly, to the USA. The war against the Soviets was won, but the price of this victory was the creation of a fully fledged narco-state. When the Soviets left, the victorious Mujahideen factions immediately turned on each other in a brutal civil war for control of Kabul and the lucrative drug trafficking routes. Amidst this chaos and destruction, a new, mysterious force emerged from the religious schools, or madrasas, on the border with Pakistan, the Taliban. They promised order, security, and the purity of true Islamic law. Their relationship with the poppy was a masterpiece of cynical pragmatism. They declared its consumption haram, sinful, but instead of eradicating its cultivation, they perfected the system of taxation, imposing a strict 10% USHR tax on the harvest, which financed their war machine and allowed them to conquer almost the entire country. Then, in July 2000, in a desperate bid for international recognition and aid, their enigmatic leader, Mullah Omar, issued a fatwa completely banning poppy cultivation. And, to the astonishment of the entire world, it worked. In a single season, they had virtually wiped out the world's largest opium crop. It was the most successful counter-narcotics operation in history. But September 11, 2001 changed everything. After the attacks orchestrated by the Taliban's guests, Al-Qaeda, the United States began bombing Afghanistan. The Taliban regime collapsed in a matter of weeks. In the power vacuum, the warlords America had allied with to topple the Taliban, the very same Mujahideen commanders from the 1980s, promptly returned to the only business they knew. The poppy fields bloomed again with a vengeance. Under the 20-year watch of U.S. and NATO forces, poppy cultivation in Afghanistan exploded to previously unseen levels. The coalition's primary mission was counter-terrorism, not counter-narcotics. Eradicating the crop meant creating new enemies among the populace and destabilizing their warlord allies. The resurgent Taliban also returned to the opium trade to finance their long and bloody war against the new invaders. The poppy paid for the improvised explosive devices that killed American and NATO soldiers. It was a perfect, self-perpetuating cycle of violence and addiction. A war feeding the drug trade, which in turn fed the war. This enormous, unstoppable river of opium, flowing from the sun-scorched mountains of Central Asia, had to go somewhere. It snaked along ancient smuggling corridors through Iran and Turkey to Europe, through Central Asia to Russia, and through Pakistan and China to the rest of the world. But at the dawn of the 21st century, this ancient, dirty trade collided with a new, parallel, and even more deadly crisis, born not in a field, but in a sterile laboratory and a gleaming office. The story begins in the USA, in the corridors of the private pharmaceutical company Purdue Pharma, owned by the secretive and fabulously wealthy Sackler family. For decades, strong opioids like oxycodone were used by doctors in a strictly limited way, mainly for terminal cancer patients or after major surgery. But the Sacklers saw not danger, but a huge, untapped market. Millions of Americans suffering from chronic non-cancer pain, back pain, arthritis, fibromyalgia. In 1996, they unleashed their weapon onto this market, a pill called OxyContin, containing a huge dose of pure oxycodone in a patented slow-release mechanism. Their marketing campaign was one of the most aggressive and deceitful in pharmaceutical history. They created an army of sales representatives who gave doctors bonuses and gifts, and promoted a revolutionary and, as it turned out, profoundly false claim. Thanks to the slow-release mechanism, the risk of addiction to OxyContin was less than 1%. They took the terrifying primal power of the poppy and packaged it into a clean, modern, doctor-approved pill. Doctors, assured of the drug's safety, began prescribing OxyContin en masse for everything from back pain to toothaches. Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family earned over $35 billion. An entire generation of patients, trusting their doctors, was systematically hooked on a drug that, when the pill was crushed, was twice as strong as street heroin. They were not junkies from the fringes, but factory workers, housewives, high school athletes, simply treating their pain. But the less than 1% claim was a catastrophic, deliberate lie. The time-release mechanism was easily bypassed by simply crushing the pill, and addiction developed even when taken strictly as prescribed. An entire nation was systematically getting hooked on drugs by its own healthcare system, turning medicine cabinets into dealers' corners. Then, too late, came the crackdown. As overdose deaths skyrocketed, authorities began to tighten the screws, sue Purdue, and restrict prescriptions. The flow of legal pills began to dry up. And here are two stories, the ancient history of the poppy and the modern story of corporate greed, converge in a final terrible synthesis. What happens to a person whose brain has been rewired by years of taking powerful opioids when their prescription suddenly runs out? They seek relief from agonizing withdrawal. And on the streets, another product was waiting for them, suddenly cheaper and more available than pills on the black market: heroin. Thanks to the perpetual, inexhaustible poppy harvest in Afghanistan, the American market was flooded with it via Mexican cartels. The very people who would never have dreamed of trying street drugs, former construction workers, students, veterans, were now learning to cook brown powder in a spoon and find a vein. The demographics of heroin addiction changed overnight, shifting from urban ghettos to quiet suburbs and the nation's heartland. The Afghan farmer growing poppies to feed his children and the laid-off worker from Ohio, who lost everything to pills, became unwitting, tragic nodes in a single global network of pain. And the poppy had one last, most brutal trick up its sleeve. As authorities began to crack down on heroin, traffickers, seeking to maximize profits, began lacing it with something even more powerful and unimaginably cheap: fully synthetic opioids like fentanyl, produced in clandestine labs in China and Mexico. Fentanyl is 100 times more potent than morphine. A few salt-like grains, enough to fit on the tip of a pencil, can be a lethal dose. This was the power of the poppy, distilled to its pure chemical essence, completely detached from the soil and the plant. It sent overdose mortality into a new, terrifying, astronomical orbit. And so, our long, dark odyssey concludes here, in our time, in this dual, intertwined crisis. The legacy of the poppy is a complex, bloody tapestry of relief and ruin, woven from threads of the divine and the diabolical. It is the Afghan farmer for whom this beautiful flower is the only hope of feeding his family in a war-torn country. It is the pharmaceutical executive in an expensive suit whose ruthless pursuit of profit created a generation of addicts and destroyed thousands of families. It is the suburban parent grieving a child lost to an overdose that began not in a squalid den, but with a sports injury and a clean prescription pad. For 6,000 years, we have sought to harness the power of this flower, to use its gift while avoiding its curse. We have built empires upon it and waged wars over it. We have synthesized its magic into pills and refined its essence into deadly powders. And yet, after all this time, all this history, all this pain, we have never truly managed to control it. It is always one step ahead, changing its form, finding new markets, exploiting our own weaknesses, our greed, our cruelty, our eternal craving for an escape from pain. The poppy continues its quiet, patient harvest, and we, its eternal debtors, are still counting the cost.